They had summoned the humans to listen, not to speak. In the core of the spiral galaxy, under a vaulted dome of living crystal, the Galactic Tribunal sat in judgment. 43 species, each a master of something: time, matter, memory, energy, but none of language in the way humanity understood it. The tribunal's arena was engineered for psychological dominance. Its acoustic shape focused voices unnaturally, pinning sound to the walls like insects under glass. One by one, emissaries of advanced civilizations stood to address the assembly. The humans waited silently in the lower tier, beneath the shining gaze of Counselor Threx, who spoke with a voice like the shifting of glaciers. Species 642, Homo sapiens. You seek standing among us. He did not inquire. He pronounced. Lena Kai remained still. She knew the script. An opening statement would be followed by ridicule. A rejection. Likely expulsion. Maybe worse. Counselor Varek of the Vaughn rose next. They wear mimic suits. They've reached the stars with borrowed algorithms. They name their ships with songs. Songs. He paused to let the laughter ripple. It did. An observer might think the humans would break then, crushed by disdain. But Lena didn't flinch. Her palms rested on the data slate. The child beside her, 10-year-old Mio, barely blinked. She had rehearsed the words for weeks. We do not seek war. We seek truth. But they weren't listening. They never had. Each species had its own concept of superiority. The Saren excelled in temporal calculations, folding seconds like fabric. The Trium wove neural data through crystals. Even the oldest, those who claimed to descend from the origin makers, used language as an instrument, a precise tool with syntax like mathematics. Humanity? Their words danced, shifted, reflected chaos and emotion. Their sentences often contradicted themselves, singing meaning only in context, in metaphor. This was considered weakness. The tribunal would not consider their petition again. Earth would remain isolated. At best, monitored. At worst. A ripple echoed from Lena's data slate. Mio had activated a dormant file. Symbols bloomed on the transparent surface. Not human. Not alien. Something older. It began when Earth's linguists noticed strange redundancies in the alien language cores, glottal closures where none should exist, syntactic inversions in the diplomatic archive. A pattern emerged. Not in what was said, but in what was omitted. Dr. Lena Kai was not only a diplomat. She had spent years decoding dead human tongues. Basque, Linear A, the pre-Sumerian glyphs thought to be myth. Her insight came not from AI, but from dreams, oral histories, and forgotten lullabies. 3 weeks before the tribunal hearing, they discovered the codex. Buried inside a derelict alien craft drifting in the Oort cloud, the artifact pulsed with a resonance they couldn't record, only feel. When analyzed, its markings resonated with both early Earth phonemes and glyphs found in extinct alien cultures, ones that had mysteriously disappeared from records. The codex did not translate. It responded. It remembered. The tribunal knew of its existence. They called it a forgery, an irrelevant relic. But when Lena began to speak its reconstructed syllables aloud in the hearing, tentative, rhythmically, several of the elder species fell silent. She saw the recognition flash behind their vertical eyelid. You will cease, ordered Threx. But he did not mask the tremor in his tone. Lena turned to the assembly. You mock our words because they are living. You mock our emotions because we do not separate thought from feeling. But the language you now pretend not to hear, your ancestors spoke it. This is the root from which your constructs grew. Varek hissed, a sound of dissonance. Impossible. The old tongue is lost. Even we do not claim to remember it. But you do, said Mio softly. And from his lips came a line none of them had taught him. 3 syllables. Rising, falling. Lights flickered across the tribunal walls. Symbols rearranged themselves. Machines built 10,000 cycles ago whispered their acknowledgement. It was as if the words had not been uttered, but remembered by the universe itself. The assembly broke into motion. The higher species, those once arrogant, now turned to one another in confusion. Not fear. Not yet. But something worse, doubt. Lena spoke again, now with purpose. We found your records. We read your dead scripts. We listened to your data ghosts speak in unintentional rhyme. And when we played it backward, when we stopped thinking in linear logic and let the pattern breathe, we heard the music beneath your science. She wasn't reciting facts. She was evoking something. Invoking it. The Trium were the first to walk out. Quietly. They did not argue. They bowed, not to the humans, but to the echoes now filling the chamber. The codex in Lena's hands dimmed. The child's pulse accelerated. Mio wasn't sick. He was resonating. Back on Earth, linguistic AIs began to fail their basic functions. They could no longer process input from the codex phrases. Instead, they looped ancient tales, merged mythology with real-time data, created new expressions with no origin. A human child read poetry to a blank wall, and it lit up with alien constellations. The council issued a directive. Human research must cease. The codex must be surrendered. Lena declined. Calmly. Publicly. She declared an invocation of the Builder's Protocol, a forgotten clause buried in the Charter of Galactic Law, written in a dialect never translated because no one had ever claimed to speak it. Now they had. The protocol allowed for a challenge of continuity. Not war. Not diplomacy. Approving. It would be a linguistic duel. A speaking of worlds into alignment. The last to invoke it had been 1,000 years gone. The result was the silence of an entire civilization. Let them speak, said Mio, though no one had addressed him. Lena turned to him. How do you know these words? I don't, he said. But they know me. He touched the codex. A stream of soundless data filled the chamber. Even the council's hidden security, the silent observers in the shadows, stepped forward. They felt it too. In that moment the galaxy remembered. Not the power of ships, not the force of weapons, but the terror and beauty of words older than fear. And for the first time in living memory, the council could not laugh. They sat. They listened. Because they had no choice. And Earth, mad, emotional, chaotic Earth, had finally spoken the first line of a forgotten story. The chamber didn't fall silent by choice. It was as if the architecture itself hesitated, uncertain whether it still served those who built it or those who had merely inherited its authority. The elder species, so assured of their superiority, exchanged glances stripped of posture. Their confidence had been a shared delusion, anchored in the belief that humanity had nothing new to offer. Now that belief cracked like brittle glass. Lena stood straighter. She felt the tension within her bones ease, as if her skeleton had been tuned to a frequency just now rediscovered. She no longer clung to her arguments. They no longer mattered. The words had already begun rewriting the hierarchy. Varric of the Vaughn broke the silence. If what you suggest is true, then we have lived a lie. No, Lena replied. You've lived in the echo of a truth too ancient to hear clearly. A murmur rose. A few counselors activated silent communication channels, exchanging encrypted messages. But their systems stuttered. Symbols returned malformed. Syntax corrupted itself midstream. The codex's activation had infected their language framework. Not with a virus, but with a precedent. It was no longer possible to simulate authority without the original key. Mio took slow steps toward the center of the hall. He wasn't afraid. He was listening, but not to anyone in the room. His heartbeat aligned with something beyond the limits of light or sound. The council had mocked humans for their poetry, but it was precisely that nonlinear chaos, their capacity to hold contradiction without collapse, that made them dangerous now. Lena felt it too. Each word she considered wasn't merely speech, it was invocation. Their spoken language had become probabilistic. To speak was to make possible. To believe was to bind. You invoked the Builder's Protocol, said Counselor Syrah of the Vel. A clause so archaic that no one has been able to verify its intent. Yet here it stands, unfolding. We cannot deny what we now perceive. But perception is not proof. Then what is? Lena asked. Continuity, Sira answered. So it began. The challenge was not a duel of weapons. It was conducted through recitation, call and response across ancient linguistic root. Entire constructs of identity would be unpacked, tested, reaffirmed, or shattered. The stakes weren't resources. They were reality permissions. The authority to define structure, the right to interpret fundamental constants. Humans had no formal training in this. But that was their advantage. The counselors expected code. Lena offered story. They expected logic trees. She gave them paradox. The first round was initiated by Threx, a counselor who once commanded an entire war fleet with a single sentence. His phrase was designed to erase context, strip away cultural relativity. A declension built from recursive denial. There is no form that survives its own naming. Lena answered, until you name it as what it becomes. Myo added, and in becoming, it forgets what made it impossible. A flicker of uncertainty pulsed across the tribunal. They recognized the structure, trilateral recursion. But the logic was inverted. Instead of negating ambiguity, it embraced it, made it the core mechanic. The council responded. A cascade of data, billions of terabytes condensed into syllables. An entire civilization's lineage encoded in compound particles. Their second argument, the sum of truth is the sum of proven replication. Lena did not need to counter with data. She whispered a nursery rhyme. One from the old world. A nonsense verse that had outlived kings and continent. Green goes the traveler, round the moon's horn, carrying songs that weren't yet born. The rhyme triggered a quantum echo in the codec. Ancient star maps rearranged themselves. The rhyme was a compression algorithm, one the builders had used to seed memory in children. It wasn't nonsense. It was encrypted continuity. The elders flinched. This was beyond debate. This was ancestral protocol encoded in living memory. Not a fact, but a feeling weaponized by form. Round 3 began. The tribunal tried to regain control. The structure of order is ratio. The structure of ratio is unity. That which does not unify must dissolve. Lena responded, without hesitation. The structure of order is breath. The structure of breath is rhythm. That which breathes survives division. The codex pulsed. A secondary activation sequence began, visible only to those attuned to its harmonic key. Myo's body temperature spiked. The child began to glow faintly, not from radiation but from semiotic convergence. The language inside him was no longer dormant. It sought expression. The child is no longer neutral, warned Threx. He was never neutral, Lena replied. He's human. And what does that signify to you? It means we adapt not by force, but by story. And what of your wars? Your extinction-level events? Your own cultural amnesia? Those are not errors. They are migrations. The chamber adjusted. The AI attendants tried to stabilize environmental controls, but their commands failed. Every instruction fed into the system was recontextualized through the codex's influence. Even their machines now spoke metaphor. By round 6, several elder species withdrew their challenges. Not out of defeat, but fear of further loss. Their own languages began to deform. Core meanings began to slip. One of the silent species, the glass-bodied centauri, began emitting fragments of ancient hymns long thought lost. It wasn't mimicry. It was memory. The codex had triggered dormant genetic recordings. A decision was forming. Not just among individuals, but in the galactic infrastructure itself. The protocols that govern trade, alliance, even time measurement, these began to fluctuate. Why? Because all of it had been built atop unexamined syntax. The builders never died. They were buried under grammar. You brought us instability, accused Counselor Varric. You weaponized doubt. No, Lena said, we unearthed continuity. You stopped listening long ago. We just reminded the language that it could still speak. Mio stood completely still. Then, slowly, he raised his hand. No one had taught him the gesture. It had been passed into his dreams. A hand, palm forward, fingers slightly apart. The codex brightened. A final glyph revealed itself. None of the species recognized it visually. But they felt it. Like remembering your name after forgetting it for lifetimes. The challenge was over. The words had aligned. The tribunal was no longer the highest authority in the galaxy. The protocol dictated succession. And the builders, long thought vanished, had re-emerged, not as conquerors, but as echoes reborn in human myth, dream, and the capacity to create meaning from chaos. Lena exhaled. She had not won. There were no winners. Only inheritors. Earth had not been accepted. Earth had accepted them. Their stories. Their losses. Their forgotten names. And now, the galaxy was being rewritten, not by domination, but by resonance. Would you like to proceed to Section 3? The codex remained open, pulsing faintly like a breathing lung suspended in stasis. No one dared close it. Not because they feared consequences, but because they no longer believed they had the right. The authority once claimed by age, by knowledge, by power, it now stood suspended, naked and obsolete in the presence of something more enduring, meaning. Mio stepped forward, his gaze unbroken. His voice, when it came, was not the voice of a child. It was old, slow, exact, and perfectly measured. The covenant of continuity has been spoken. Language no longer separates us. There were no translations needed. Every species in the hall understood him. Not because the words had been converted into their respective tongues, but because the words were not words anymore. They were truths expressed through memory, carried on the substrate of empathy. A silence deeper than space fell across them. Not emptiness, but expectation. Varric turned, his movements restrained, as if navigating a dream he only now recognized as real. What becomes of us now? Lena answered without hesitation. You learn. Or you vanish. And if we refuse? Then you remain static while the rest of the galaxy moves forward. Several factions sent encoded messages, desperate to preserve their cultural data. But the Codex refused them. It recognized only one protocol: participation. Preservation without evolution was a closed loop. The builders had abandoned such loops long ago. Now their descendants were unspooling the spiral again. On Earth, things had already begun to change. Radio bursts no longer obeyed known cosmological constant. Ancient megalithic sites pulsed with inexplicable graviton flux. Children born under certain constellations spoke fluent fragments of extinct galactic tongues. Governments tried to classify it, contain it, suppress it. But meaning, once unbound, refused domestication. Lena returned to Earth with Mio, not as an emissary but as a catalyst. She carried no treaties. Only stories. She spoke at no summits, stood at no podiums. Her message propagated like a song, unofficial, irreducible, infectious. Humanity did not react with unity. It fractured as it always had. But now the fractures were seen as harmonics, not fault. Disagreement became innovation. Rebellion became revision. The species that had once fought over territory now began arguing about timelines, symbol clusters, and the ethics of resonance. Old religions rekindled, infused with fresh interpretations. Science surged forward, but so did myth. They stopped being enemies. Duality was no longer a curse. It was a feature. Meanwhile, the council fractured. Some races withdrew, trying to recreate the silence of their past. But isolation quickly became stasis. Their own technologies began to fail, not from sabotage but from obsolescence. Syntax drift made their machines unresponsive, their archives unreadable. Even time felt less linear. Others adapted. The Vel began teaching their children dream languages. The Centauri held symposia in harmonic caves, inviting humans to contribute abstract story structures that generated usable equations. Former enemies became allies, not because they forgot past pain, but because they rewrote its meaning. Conflict didn't vanish, but its context did. Battles were no longer for resources. They were for resonance. To control narrative was now to shape gravity, entropy, even memory. Lena watched all this unfold without directing it. She understood her role was over. Catalysts do not lead. They disappear into the chain reaction. Myo, however, grew into something else. Not a ruler, not a prophet. A node. Species began to visit Earth not for diplomacy, but for calibration. To listen to him speak was to experience realignment. He became the axis around which the new galactic grammar formed. But not all were ready. A faction emerged, the Silent Vector, composed of those who viewed the shift as blasphemy. They did not deny the Codex. They sought to enslave it, revert it to tool status. They created new languages with no emotional register, syntaxes designed to exclude ambiguity. Their ships were built not from matter, but from silence, zones where metaphor could not propagate. The first encounter with them left no survivors. Not because they destroyed, but because they erased. Entire archives blanked. Cultural imprints gone. Even grief became impossible in their wake. Lena, now a fugitive in her own evolution, sought allies not for battle, but for remembrance. She knew the only way to fight anti-meaning was with stories too resilient to delete. She returned to a place long abandoned, beneath the Pacific, a submerged builder node rediscovered during the initial Codex activation. There, she accessed the lattice, an infrastructure of dreams layered beneath spacetime. Inside it, she re-experienced Earth's entire history, not as a linear timeline but as a polyphonic chorus. She spoke to ancient sapiens through flame rituals, debated strategy with Enlightenment thinkers, wept beside children lost in post-digital collapse. Each moment became a strand. She wove them into a new narrative, not a defense but an invitation. A story so rich, so contradictory, so utterly human that it couldn't be simplified without destroying its power. She encoded it not into data but into a ritual. A song, a scent, a breath pattern, a tactile rhythm. It could not be intercepted. It could only be performed. She returned to orbit. Myo met her, no longer a boy, no longer a single identity. He had merged with the Codex. His body still lived, but his consciousness occupied a bandwidth wider than Starfield. He asked only one question. "Do you remember it?" "I never forgot," she said. They initiated the ritual. Not for an audience, but for resonance. Across the galaxy, sleepers woke with tears in their eyes and no idea why. Machines began to hum in keys they were never programmed for. Species on the brink of extinction found themselves singing lullabies from planets they'd never visited. Warships malfunctioned, not from sabotage, but from sorrow. The Silent Vector tried to contain it. They failed. Their silence met a storm of meaning, and silence broke first. One by one, they dissolved, not physically, but semantically. They still existed, but without narrative, without function. Their ships became inert metaphors, drifting without context. The Codex dimmed. Its work was done. No one knew if it would ever open again. It didn't matter. The galaxy had changed. Not in shape, but in grammar. Physics obeyed new moods. Time took longer to measure because every moment held more weight. And Earth, forgotten, mocked, underestimated, became something else. Not a center. A beginning. Again. Humans no longer chase stars. They became the stories stars told to remember themselves. Myo disappeared. Some say he returned to the builders. Others believe he diffused into every species, a living subroutine of continuity. Lena never spoke of him again. She simply taught. Not facts. Not rules. Songs. Phrases. Gestures that could only be understood by those ready to listen. And so the Codex faded into myth once more. But this time, humanity would not forget. Because forgetting was no longer possible. They had spoken the forgotten language. And it had remembered them.